So if you're new and you want to know what this program's all about, reread this story or read it along with us and think about what we're doing. Okay, now we're going to find Bill on page 1, 1917, and war fever ran high in the New England town to which we new young officers from Plattsburgh were assigned. And we were flattered when the first citizens took us to their homes, making us feel heroic. That wouldn't happen these days, would it? Keep those warmongers out of my house. Bunch of cowboys. Just like our president, right? That's what they're saying about him now. Here was love, applause, war, moments sublime with intervals hilarious. See how romanticizing this war thing Bill was making it? And this was what was going on in his head. He was loving this stuff. He was in uniform, he was an officer, they were treating him like a hero. Wow, this was great stuff. Lots of fun, lots of laughs. I was part of life at last. And in the midst of the excitement, I discovered liquor. Now, in other writings, Bill has described this discovery as being this. He said it was the release from pain. And later, of course, you and I have come to understand from our own experience that fear is extraordinarily painful. And all of a sudden, bulletproof, wow, immortal, 10 feet tall, irresistible, funny, absolutely charming, handsome, beautiful. It was all there because the pain of fear was gone. I forgot the strong warnings and prejudices of my people concerning drink. In time, we sailed for over there. I was very lonely, and again I turned to liquor, to alcohol. We landed in England. I visited Winchester Cathedral. Much moved, I wandered outside. My attention was caught by a doggerel on an old tombstone. But while Bill was in that cathedral, in other writings he tells us about this, that there was something that happened to him while he was in that cathedral, that there was like this great wind blowing through, and he felt tremendously close to God at that time. It was quite a powerful experience for him. And when he tells us a little bit later about what happened to him when he had that epiphany, you know, that very powerful spiritual experience later, he relates that as if he was again experiencing what he had experienced in the Winchester Cathedral. So I moved outside, I wandered outside, my attention was caught by a doggerel, and this is on an old tombstone. Now here we need to kind of consider what we're going to be reading, because if you were to go to Winchester Cathedral today, you would find this tombstone. It has been replaced twice. The Hampshire Grenadiers are a regiment which is still in existence, and they have maintained this tombstone. And if you were to go there on a warm spring day at lunchtime, you would find the people, the secretaries and so forth from the businesses across the street over there in that graveyard sitting around having their lunch, some of them laying up against this tombstone. Now, you may not believe this, but I do. I think this is the most famous tombstone in the whole world, because the same verse in 28 languages and something like 70 million volumes of this book is scattered all over the world. Everybody who's ever read this book has read this tombstone. Here lies a Hampshire Grenadier. The Grenadier was a foot soldier. Literally threw grenades. That's what they called them. They were just kind of hand bombs. Here lies a Hampshire Grenadier. Hampshire is the regiment. who caught his death drinking cold, small beer. Now, the beer was cold, and it was a small beer, which in England at that time was something other than stout or ale or one of the more potent drinks. A small beer didn't mean the size of the glass or anything, or the mug. It's talking about the potency and the color. It was a lighter beer. So he caught his death drinking cold, small beer. Now what I imagine this, because I saw this happen in Las Vegas one time, and this is probably clear off base, but I was on Las Vegas Boulevard on the Strip, and it was about 115 degrees in the middle of the summer. It was so hot on the pavement, if you didn't have thick soles on, you'd burn your feet. And this guy came stumbling out of a bar, and apparently he'd been sitting there drinking cold beer, and he hit that wall of that heat, and he died. Boom, it nailed him just like that. So I'm thinking maybe that's what happened to this guy. A good soldier is never forgot, whether he dieth by musket or by pot. And I know what all of you are thinking. This is not wacky tobacco. The word pot here refers to the receptacle for the beer. If you went into a pub in those days, you would order a pot. And today, if you went in and ordered a pot, the bobbies would arrest you. But in those days, you ordered a pot and it was filled with beer or ale or whatever you were getting. And so they're saying, even though he didn't die out there by getting shot, he's still a good soldier. And it just happens that he died because he had a cold, small beer. And maybe they're really saying he drank himself to death, but I kind of doubt it. Ominous warning, which I failed to heed. Bill is saying, look at this. He died by drinking a cold, small beer. Ominous warning, which I failed to heed. 22, and a veteran of foreign wars, I went home at last. I fancied myself a leader, or had not the men of my battery given me a special token of appreciation? My talent for leadership, I imagined, would place me at the head of vast enterprises, which I would manage with the utmost assurance. Now, I know there's nobody in here who didn't have those thoughts at 22. Grandiosity, that's one of the hallmarks of us, you know. And most of us have got a pretty good reason to be grandiose, you know. We're pretty smart people. We've got a whole hell of a lot in the ball. It's amazing how many people who come in here would, if they chose to apply, would be embraced immediately by Mensa. And people in AA, and I'm not so many of them, have been extremely successful in their life, not necessarily monetarily, but in their achievements. I don't know whether that means anything or not, but I certainly have seen it. Talking about that we come from the upper echelons of society, by no means. That doesn't seem to have anything to do with it. But here is our friend Bill, who having come back from the war, was ready to conquer the world. Let's go on page 2 now. I took a night law course and obtained employment as investigator for a surety company. He says the drive for success was on, we're top of page 2 now. I proved to the world I was important. My work took me about Wall Street, and little by little I became interested in the market. Many people lost money, but some became very rich. Why not I? I studied economics and business as well as law. Potential alcoholic that I was, I nearly failed my law course. At one of the finals, I was too drunk to think or write. Though my drinking was not yet continuous, it disturbed my wife. We had long talks when I would still her forebodings by telling her that when men of genius conceived their best projects, they were drunk. That the most majestic constructions of philosophic thought were so derived. Well, look at Papa down there in Key West. Look at the beautiful stuff he's writing. By the time I'd completed the course, I knew the law was not for me. The inviting maelstrom of Wall Street had me in its grip. Business and financial leaders were my heroes. Out of this alloy of drink and speculation, I commenced to forge the weapon that one day would turn in its flight like a boomerang and all but cut me to ribbons. Living modestly, my wife and I saved $1,000. It went into certain securities, then cheap and rather unpopular. I rightly imagined they would someday have a great rise. I failed to persuade my broker friends to send me out looking over factories and managements, but my wife and I decided to go anyway. I developed a theory that most people lost money in stocks through ignorance of markets. I discovered many more reasons later on. We gave up our positions and off we roared on a motorcycle. The sidecar stuffed with tent, blankets, a change of clothes, 3 huge volumes of financial reference service. He isn't saying it, but of course, and also Lois. You can imagine what that looked like. Our friends thought a lunacy commission should be appointed. We don't have those anymore, but lunacy commission, that was a real thing. It was kind of a star chamber where somebody would rat you out if you were crazy. And then the cops would see to it that you were hauled before a lunacy commission. And the purpose there was to find out whether you were crazy or not, and if you were, to incarcerate you somewhere in Bedlam where you'd never surface again. Perhaps they were right. I had some success at speculation, so we had a little money, but we once worked on a farm for a month to avoid drawing on our small capital. That was the last honest manual labor on my part for many a day. We covered the whole eastern United States in a year. At the end of this journey, at the end of it, my reports to Wall Street procured me a position there and the use of a large expense account. What he's not saying, and in other writings he tells us about, he was sending these reports in like weekly, and some of the guys, the bright guys on Wall Street, began to see that this was a straight poop. This was present information. This was current, and it was like today, everything is so, nobody's hidden anymore because everything is wide open through the internet and the phone, and everybody knows everybody's business now, but in those days it was pretty hard to get information, and here was Bill with first-hand stuff, and these guys on the street were cashing in on it big time, so as soon as he got back, they immediately brought him into the company, gave him a big expense account. Boy, he loved that. The exercise of an option brought in more money, leaving us with a profit of several $1,000s for that year. For the next few years, he says, fortune threw money and applause my way. I had arrived, he said. Oh boy. His motto was, whether you're rich or poor, it's nice to have money. Oh boy. Anyway, maybe someday. I got a deal I'm doing right now that see, you never quit. I mean, this ain't going to make me $1 million, I promise you. And no, you can't borrow any of it either. I'm keeping it all for myself. Okay. My judgment and ideas were followed by many to the tune of paper millions. And I swear to you that this was more important to Bill than the money he was making. That he was being accorded all of this notoriety, all of this love and attention, and people considering him to be a financial wizard was much more important to him than the money. I keep telling people, others will work much harder for their name and lights than they ever will for money. Give them recognition. Well, they're just doing what they're supposed to do. Good. Well, your company's going on its butt, friend. The company that recognizes the need of human beings to be recognized for their as being worthwhile, being given pats on the back and plaudits and awards and all that, that's a company that survives. The great boom of the late 20s was seething and swelling. Drink was taking an important and exhilarating part of my life. There was loud talk in the jazz places uptown. You got to remember now, this is Prohibition. And so these jazz places, of course, were all, what did they call them in those days? Speakeasy. Yeah, they were all well, you know, all you had to do to keep a speakeasy open is pay off the cops. And, you know, and buy your liquor from the mob, and then everything was fine. Nobody bothered you. Everyone spending thousands and chattered in millions. Scoffers could scoff and be damned. I made a host of fair-weather friends. My drinking assumed more serious proportions, continuing all day and almost every night. The remonstrances of my friends terminated in a row, and I became a lone wolf. There were many unhappy scenes in our sumptuous apartment. There had been no real infidelity. I love that word, real, don't you? What in the hell is no real infidelity? Oh man, that's about as weak-kneed as honest desire. No real infidelity. I guess maybe my mind just runs in those channels. Anyway, for loyalty to my wife, helped at times by extreme drunkenness, kept me out of those scrapes. Anyway, our friend Bill doesn't start his story until he's about ready to go into the Army, and this was in 1917 when the United States entered the First World War, and we started sending boys over there. And it was a wonderful time over here, parties and everything. They were going out to save the world. And of course, none of them ever had their taste of trench warfare yet, and mustard gas and all that other good stuff, and machine guns, and the first tanks were just rumbling around there. I mean, it was a miserable, rotten, stinking, dirty war. But when they were here, they were heroes, and those were easier, softer days. They were simpler days. Patriotism was not something to be sneered at. Since 9/11, I guess it isn't anymore, is it? Thank God for that. Not for 9/11, but something's happening with this country. We're beginning to sense that we need to get together and not be pulling apart all the time. If everybody in this country was in AA, we could really fix everything, couldn't we, guys? Can you imagine 250 million people, all of whom were practicing our code, which is to be kind and loving toward all and considerate, and we would, what a world this could be. It reminds me, the other day I was reviewing some stuff I wrote for a church, the 12 Steps for Christians, and something kind of popped out. There's an Old Testament prophet, one of the minor guys. His name was Micah, M-I-C-A-H, and Janine knows about him. This guy, he's only got about 4 pages or 5 pages in the Old Testament, so he wasn't any big deal. But this guy Micah, he was alive at a time and writing at a time which was relatively free of war and strife, and so it was kind of a peaceful time. And so the people came to Micah and they asked him, what does God expect of us? And they thought he was going to reply something like, well, sacrifice 10,000 skins of wine and 4,200 newborn lambs and a whole bunch of goats and stuff. But he didn't. What he said was, what God expects of you is that you be just, that you be merciful, and that you walk humbly with your God. And when I read that, I said, aha, that's pretty familiar. That sounds just like AA to me. Practice mercy, practice justice, and walk humbly with your God. And that's exactly what we're learning to do as we read the Big Book. especially the walking humbly with your God part. When we get back into the 7th chapter, it's going to tell us what a sponsor is. It doesn't say sponsor, of course. That word is never used in the Big Book, except maybe in a couple of stories. Because they didn't have sponsors when this thing was written. But in one sentence, it tells us the whole story of sponsorship. It says, both you and the new man must walk day by day in the path of spiritual progress. Two people walking the spiritual path together. And I often wonder how many people who claim to be sponsors these days have ever read that or understand what it means.
What page?
Two people, 100. Two people walking day by day in the path of spiritual progress. And that's the whole basis of our program. That's where it all started. If you want to know what AA is all about, think about what happened when Bill went to Akron and he sat down with Dr. Bob, and he told Dr. Bob his story, and he told Dr. Bob how he drank and how alcohol affected him and how he tried to stop and couldn't, and he told Dr. Bob about the anger and the frustration, the bitterness, the rage, about the overwhelming fear and anxiety, about his resentments and his dishonesty, and how he tried to stop and could not. And Dr. Bob, and listening to him, knew that Bill knew what he was talking about, because that's the same things that Dr. Bob had experienced. And then Bill told him about the disease of alcoholism, and then he told him, Dr. Bob, how Bill had recovered. And it's the same stuff we're going to read in here, because what he was talking to Dr. Bob about is exactly what we're going to find when we get to page 13. Although we're going to pick up a little bit of it before as we go through it. And there are about 4 pages that detail Bill's first step and his second step. And then when he gets to the hospital for the 3rd time, he works the rest of the steps. And so we're going to see how all of that happened. And when he went to Akron, that's what he told Dr. Bob. He explained to him what he had done and how he had recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. And it was that which got through to Bob. That's what Bob was waiting to hear. And of course, as they say, the rest is history. But there we find 2 guys. You see, Bill could not have survived if he didn't find Bob. We got to face that as a fact, because had he not found Bob, we wouldn't be here. There'd be no AA. That slender thread that we talked about early on was one of those things that had to happen, because Bill was at the hotel and he was ready to drink. I mean, he was at the end of his rope. Something told him to find another alcoholic to talk to, and he found Bob. And because he was willing to share his recovery with Bill, and Bill was willing to share his recovery with Bob, and because they were both willing to get on that spiritual path, they both got to grow spiritually, and they both recovered, and they both stayed sober for the rest of their lives. And so we can see this right from the very beginning, and we'll see it here in Bill's story. This is where it started, and they were doing exactly what the rest of the book tells us. And as we go through Bill's story, I want you to see how it simply brings us along from Bill's drinking career and his attempts to stop and his hospitalizations up to the point where he was given the message, which was a message he was willing to listen to. And then eventually the first and second steps came through to him. And then in the hospital, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 11 came to him. And then a little later, while still in the hospital, 12 came to him. And all this happened. And then a little later, while still in the hospital, 12 came to him. And all this happened. And Bill Wilson's story is a story which is absolutely true. What he's telling us is what really went on with him. It's a story which almost every alcoholic can identify with, at least in part. And Bill was a guy who was extremely egotistical. He's a power driver. right from the get-go, he was looking for acclaim and for satisfaction, for money, for power, prestige. And this pretty much drove him, not just before he got sober, but after he got sober. And Bill's history as a grand guru of AA is spotted all the way through with his struggles to deal with this egoism and this power driving and his desire for acclaim and his desire to be the boss. As a matter of fact, at one time in the late 40s and early 50s, Bill got into a lot of trouble because of that. There were enough people in the fellowship by then who were striving themselves for recognition and for leadership that they began to push him out. And by the time he found out that his reliance, his dependence on the fellowship wasn't working, and he became very, very depressed, and in fact, in accordance with his own words, he became suicidal. And this continued up into the middle 50s. When he finally decided to let go of any idea that he was still the leader of AA, that's when he started to get well again. That's a fascinating kind of sidelight to Bill's story. This chapter does not go back into his childhood. We are not treated to any discussion of his dysfunctional family or any of that stuff. I remember the first time I saw that was about 10 years ago, and I thought, what in the hell is that, dysfunctional family? Heck, everybody's dysfunctional. Well, then I saw a book on one of these, I think it was a newsstand, but they had all these paperbacks, and there was one there that had a red cover and a blue stripe across it. And the title of the book was, I'm Dysfunctional, You're Dysfunctional, We Are All Dysfunctional. I said, hooray, somebody finally got it right, you know. Oh my. It's amazing, you know, what's happened. This little editorializer, if you don't mind. What's happening is something that I get very disturbed about. I guess most of you know that by now. Because I'm a traditionalist in the worst, you know, just to the nth degree, and I believe the big book is right in what it says, and that the directions are there for us to follow. And that's what I've done, and so of course if I've done the work for me, then it's got to be okay for you, I guess. And I've taken over 2,000 people through the steps, and I keep teaching the same stuff, and they keep doing it, and it keeps working, so I'm pretty well sold on it. But boy, there is so much, I hate to use the word, but deviationism out there, away from the directions in the big book, and sometimes it's very hard for me. I want to stand up and say, whoa, wait a second, where in the hell did you get that? Where did that come from? Just, you know, the other day, it was weird. I got to pass this along to you. I had this fellow I know, was a really nice guy, and he's been around for about a year and a half, and I said, well, you know, where are you in the steps? He said, well, I'm on my first step. I said, oh, wow, you've been sober a year and a half? He says, yeah, but I'm still trying to answer those questions. I said, what questions? Where are the questions in the first step? I'm not familiar with that. Why don't you bring me these questions? So he brought this, it was about that thick. I'm not kidding you now, double space or single spaced on both sides of the paper. With a Pica typewriter. Somebody typed this thing, didn't have an electric typewriter. And I don't know, I guess maybe it must have been for a master's thesis or something. But there were 697 questions here. And I'll give you a sample question. This was supposed to be first step now. Did you ever get caught masturbating? I said, holy cow, what is that? He said, I said, how much longer do you think it's going to take you to answer all these questions? Well, some of them required a 10-page essay to answer. So he said, well, I figure about another year, maybe. I hated to ask him who his sponsor was, because I didn't really want to know. So anyway, you guys have gotten to know me well enough. You know now that I like to stick to the book and the directions in the book, and I believe those directions are there for you and me to follow. And I believe that when we follow them, we get well, and if we continue to follow them, we stay well, and we stay in a recovered state, which is free of the hopelessness and helplessness that we came in with, and that we stay close to God, and that we have our heritage, which is to be happy, joyous, and free, and that we can carry the message, and we can watch the light come back in the eyes of others, and we can have a host of friends, and we stay close to God, and we are God conscious, and we enter the world of spirit, and we have vital sixth sense, which allows us to be in communion with God from time to time. And all of these things come about because we carefully follow directions, the directions in the big book. So that's where I'm coming from, and that's what you're going to hear from me as long as you stick around with this meeting. And by the way, that's likely to be another year and a half, because we're not going very fast in this book.